What's the most genius trap you've seen? Someone lay inside a contract, will, or prenup. Story 1. Oh man, I've got one for the books. This happened early in my career when I was working under a senior partner who specialized in high net worth estate planning. We had this wealthy client, we'll call him Mr. Whitaker, who was pushing 80 and had been married 3 times. His current wife was significantly younger and very concerned about what she'd inherit if he died. She kept pushing for a revision of his will and trust, very subtle, very charming, but definitely persistent. So Mr. Whitaker comes in and tells us to go ahead and update everything, give her the nice beach house, a generous allowance, blah blah. But with one specific clause he wanted buried in the fine print of the trust distribution. The clause was this: if my spouse shall challenge or inquire into the valuation of any trust asset, or attempt to dispute or renegotiate the distribution of any estate asset, her share shall be reduced to $1. We even gave it an obscure legal name so it wouldn't scream poison pill. She signed off without ever batting an eye. The estate was locked airtight. Sure enough, about 3 months after he passed, she got greedy and brought in her own legal team to contest the value of a certain private business Mr. Whitaker owned, claiming it had been underreported and she was owed more. The trap was sprung. She went from inheriting a $7 million property and a lifelong stipend to a single dollar and a rejection letter. Her lawyer looked like he'd swallowed a stapler when we pointed it out in court. Genius level petty, watertight legally. I still think about that one when I draft tricky clauses for high conflict families. Before we continue, do us a quick favor, smash that like button and subscribe to support our channel. Story 2. About 10 years ago, I was in a very weird career moment. One of those crossroads where you're fielding multiple job offers and trying to decide whether to chase stability or take a gamble. I'd been working in 24-hour media for over a decade at that point, and while I loved the work, the hours were brutal. Nights, weekends, overnights, it chews people up. So when I got approached by 2 companies at once, I saw an opportunity to build some actual quality of life into the next chapter of my career. The first offer came from a fairly traditional media company, decent name recognition, semi-reliable pay, but they were being cheap, like nickel and dime you on your lunch break cheap. My agent and I tried to pad the offer with more vacation time, flexibility, and some bonus perks, but every request turned into a battle. The second offer came from a shiny new startup. They were loud, flashy, and promised the moon, billions in funding, disrupting the industry, all the usual buzzwords. But here's the thing, they were on a tight clock. Their launch date was rapidly approaching, and they needed people locked in, fast. This gave us leverage, and I knew it. So I told my agent, look, if I'm going to take a risk and jump to a startup, I want real boundaries in place. No nights, no weekends, no overnights, period. And to her credit, she came back with a contract that had exactly that ironclad language that guaranteed me a Monday to Friday daytime schedule. Not only that, but we went a step further and added a clear penalty structure if they ever tried to break it. The clause literally said that if I was required to work a night, weekend, or overnight shift, I'd get additional paid vacation days for each offense. No ambiguity. No vague HR promises. It was spelled out in plain English. The execs didn't love it, but they were in such a rush to launch that they signed without much pushback. I accepted, fully aware the startup could crash and burn in a year. But hey, 2 years of decent pay and a sane schedule, worth the risk. And then came the real fun. Exactly 1 year to the day after launch, the startup collapsed like a house of cards. Turns out those billions in funding were more like millions of assumptions. Ad revenue was tanking, and almost everyone was laid off in one swoop. Except me, because my contract had no early out clause. It was a 2-year non-cancelable agreement. They were stuck with me for 12 more months. And guess what the execs tried to pull first? You guessed it. We are going to need you to start working overnights and weekends. They said it almost gleefully, like they wanted me to argue or walk away. I think they were hoping I'd rage quit and free them from the contract. But instead I smiled and calmly said, actually, I don't work weekends, nights, or overnights. That's in my contract. And if you want me to start doing that, you'll owe me a paid vacation day for every single shift. The executive's face dropped like a bad signal. They were cornered and they knew it. From that moment on, they tried everything to get me to quit. Passive-aggressive emails, weirdly vague job duties, random last-minute assignments, anything to make life uncomfortable. But I just stuck to the agreement and did my job, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. Eventually, they realized the only way to be rid of me was to pay out the full remainder of my contract, which they finally did. So yeah, not a trap in the malicious sense, but in terms of airtight contract work, that clause was the best insurance policy I ever had. A lot of people lost their jobs that year, but I walked out with 12 months' pay, a clean record, and a big fat reminder of the power of a well-written agreement. Always read your contracts, kids, and if you're lucky enough to have leverage, use it. Story 3. All right, this one is a bit of a roller coaster, and I had a front row seat to watch it unfold. I'm a lawyer who specializes in estate planning and trust administration, so I've seen my fair share of creative clauses designed to incentivize or restrict certain behavior. This one, this one was genius, pure genius. I once reviewed an estate plan for a client's grandfather, a wealthy businessman who had accumulated a pretty sizable fortune over the years. The grandfather, let's call him Mr. A, had a large trust fund set up for his grandchildren, but the way he went about it was nothing short of a trap wrapped in generosity. Here's how it worked. Mr. A's will stated that each grandchild would inherit a large sum of money from the trust, but there was a significant catch. They wouldn't receive any of the inheritance until they turned 30 unless they passed a personal finance course. Not just any course, mind you, but one specifically approved by the trustees, a financial education course that Mr. A had carefully crafted and vetted himself with the help of some experts, of course. The idea was that if they wanted to access the full inheritance, they had to prove they were financially responsible and could manage the wealth appropriately. At first, the grandchildren thought it was a joke. They laughed it off. Grandpa's just being grandpa, some of them said. We can just skip the course and get the money anyway, others thought. But here's where it got brilliant. The trustees were absolutely strict about enforcing this clause. If a grandchild refused to take the course, or if they failed, they were only allowed to receive a capped annual payout of $30,000. Not a penny more. That's it. And for the ones who decided to skip the course, they were stuck with that measly annual payout for life. The trustees didn't negotiate. They didn't budge. They followed Mr. A's instructions to the letter. Well, a few of the grandchildren, convinced they could work around it, ignored the course and thought they could sweet-talk the trustees into bypassing the condition. Big mistake. The trustees stuck to their guns, and those who didn't pass the course were left with only small yearly installments. No lump sums, no early payouts, just $30K annually for the rest of their lives. On the other hand, the grandchildren who took the course, passed it, and showed they had a reasonable understanding of personal finance, were granted millions outright, no strings attached. They were free to do what they wanted with the money. In the end, the ones who took the course and completed it in good faith were rewarded with their full inheritance. No waiting, no hassle. But the ones who tried to avoid it were stuck with an annual trickle forever. What makes this so clever is that it was a financial literacy test disguised as a gift. The grandfather wasn't just leaving them wealth, he was making sure they were prepared to handle it, and no lawyer, no matter how skilled, could have broken that clause or invalidated it. The grandkids who didn't take it seriously were left with a lifelong lesson in delayed gratification. Honestly, Mr. A might have been a tough old bird, but he was a brilliant one. I've never seen a more effective way to ensure that only the financially responsible heirs actually enjoyed the fruits of the family wealth. It was a trap, sure, but it was a genius one. Story 4. This one still makes me laugh and respect the hell out of the guy. A few years back, I helped draft a prenup for a client who was marrying a woman he loved dearly, but who had a track record of impulsive spending. He wasn't trying to be controlling or stingy, just realistic. He owned a few businesses and had a sizable inheritance coming his way, so he wanted to make sure things stayed protected without starting World War III before the wedding. Here's the genius part. Instead of outright limiting access to money, we included a clause that created a joint lifestyle account. Each year, he'd deposit $150,000 into it, plenty for a very comfortable lifestyle. Anything beyond that would need both signatures and a 30-day cooling-off period. But here sits where it gets beautiful. There was a hidden clause that said, if either party initiates divorce proceedings within the first 5 years and the total joint lifestyle account spending exceeds $750,000, the initiating party forfeits any claim to shared assets beyond that account. In short, she could spend like crazy if she stayed married. But if she tried to cash out early, she'd only walk away with what was already spent. Fast forward 3 years, she files for divorce right after blowing through almost $450K in 1 year on designer crap and business investments that were, let's just say, not viable. She expected a payout, assuming she'd walk away with half. Then came discovery. The prenup held. Every penny spent beyond that $750K was her only take-home. No slice of the company's, no half of the trust fund, no alimony, just her receipts. And the kicker? The prenup also included a clause requiring arbitration, so she couldn't drag it out in court. Sometimes people think prenups are about greed, but really they can be next-level chess. Story 5. Family law. Not proud of this one, but here it is. Saw a prenup once that was technically legal, but morally, yeah, questionable. Contract stated, everything the husband earns is 100% his. Everything the wife earns is 100% hers. But if the wife worked for the husband's business, all of her labor would be considered a gift to him. No wages, no stake in the business, no claim to future earnings, nothing. And here's where it gets sinister. The wife didn't speak English. The husband hired her an attorney, his buddy, paid the guy extra to backdate the prenup so it looked like she had time to review and consider it. She ends up working for years at his company doing admin and customer support, thinking she sips helping their future. Meanwhile, every bit of labor was legally considered unpaid and unclaimable. If they divorced, she walked away with zero part of the business. Despite helping run it, the prenup held. And yeah, he basically got a loyal, full-time employee for free. Genius? Technically. Evil? Absolutely. Let this be a PSA. Never let the other party pay for your lawyer. Story 6. Not exactly a genius trap in the traditional sense, but definitely one of the most low-key nuclear bomb inclusions I've ever seen tucked inside a will. A few years back, this older gentleman comes into my office, wanting to update his estate plan. Friendly guy, mid-60s, semi-retired, wore nice clothes, but had the vibe of someone used to being underestimated. He tells me he's been married 30-plus years, has 2 grown kids, and runs a small but successful consulting firm. Says he wants to keep things simple and clean, standard distribution to his wife and kids, some money to charity, all that jazz. Pretty boilerplate stuff. But near the end of the appointment, he casually adds, "Oh, and I still like to leave $100,000 to my secretary if that SEP's all right." I pause and ask if she's a longtime employee or family friend. He smirks, that knowing, don't ask questions you don't want the answers to kind of smirk, and says, let's just say she's been very loyal. So now I'm staring at this dude, wondering if he realizes the absolute chaos that's going to explode when his wife sees this clause. He just waves it off, says his wife doesn't need to know all the details now. We draft the will, and per his request, the secretary's $100K is buried in a list of other minor bequests, just enough camouflage to not immediately scream a fair payout. Now, to be clear, everything about this was legal. His money, his will, his choice. But it was also clear that he knew exactly what he was doing. He left just enough plausible deniability to make his wife and kids wonder, but never know. Was she a mistress? Was it hush money? Was she secretly his daughter? Yes, we've seen that before too. It was like leaving a live grenade in the middle of a Thanksgiving table and just walking out. The man passed away less than a year later. I wasn't involved in the probate process, but I heard through another attorney that when the family read the will, it went about how you'd expect. Wife was furious, kids were confused, and the secretary, well, she cashed the check and never looked back. Story 7. Not a lawyer, but I definitely walked into what I now realize was a genius-level prenup trap, set with surgical precision by someone else's grandma. So my girlfriend Jenny and I have been together since college, met sophomore year when she transferred in, started dating junior year, and we've been inseparable ever since. We're both 28 now. I'm in software development, and she's an in-house attorney at some finance-adjacent company. Honestly, I have no idea what her company actually does, and I've asked. We're both doing well career-wise, though I'll admit she out-earns me, and I'm totally fine with that. She's always been super down-to-earth, frugal even. Think meal prepping, buying clothes on sale, and driving the same beat-up Subaru since college. Which is why what I found out over Easter dinner hit me like a freight train. So, this past weekend, we drove up to meet her extended family for the first time. I'd met her parents before, lovely people. Her mom is a pediatric surgeon who works at a nonprofit hospital, and her dad's a former teacher turned stay-at-home dad. Apparently, her and her brothers gave their nanny a non-fatal heart attack as toddlers, and he just decided to take over childcare from then on. I always assumed they were upper middle class, maybe quietly well off, sure, but nothing crazy. Then I met her grandmother, old school, sharp as a razor, and clearly the one running the family from behind the curtain. After dinner, she pulled me aside. No preamble, no pleasantries, and handed me what looked like a novella-length legal document. I laughed nervously and asked, "Is this homework?" She said stone-faced, "This is the prenup you'll be signing before you marry my granddaughter." I was stunned. She went on to explain that she didn't care about whatever Jenny and I accumulated together, our salaries, our condo, our retirement accounts. Split it however the hell you want, her exact words. But the family money? Untouchable. At this point, my brain is short-circuiting because, what family money? Turns out Jenny and her siblings are heirs to one of the biggest privately owned pharmacy chains in the country. Like quiet dynasty-level wealth. Apparently, her grandmother started buying up small pharmacies in the 70s and now controls a portfolio worth hundreds of millions. Jenny's never mentioned it. Not once. I knew she worked during college, sometimes 30-plus hours a week, bartending or tutoring, just to pay for her own stuff. I also knew she got a $48K/year academic scholarship and always made a big deal about not taking money from her parents. So yeah, when I found out she's probably worth more than most startup founders, I was shook. The prenup, though, that thing was bulletproof. It had layers. Not only did it wall off all premarital assets and future inheritances, it even specified that any appreciation of family-owned assets during the marriage would still be considered separate, as would any business Jenny might start using intellectual capital derived from family legacy. It read like it had been reviewed by a full team of estate planners and contract ninjas. I haven't had the guts to bring it up with Jenny yet, and I'm honestly not sure she even knows her grandmother gave it to me. She and her grandma aren't close, and she always sort of waves off questions about the extended family. But looking at that prenup, I could only admire the chessboard I didn't even realize I was standing on. Grandma didn't just protect the family fortune. She set up a legal minefield so that even accidental encroachment would be blocked. It was ironclad and emotionally surgical. Genius move? 100%. Romantic? Not even remotely. Still dating Jenny, though. Maybe we'll get around to having that conversation soon. Maybe. Story 8. Not a lawyer myself, but my family ended up finding an absolutely brilliant one when we needed them most. And I'll never forget the legal trap they uncovered that basically saved us. This happened about 13 years ago. My father was a hard-working businessman in Portugal. He had built up a small but successful firm from the ground up over the course of decades. He was old school, hands-on, the kind of guy who signed every contract himself, kept every receipt, and still did things by hand when others had moved on to computers. Then he got cancer. Bad and fast. Within months, he was no longer able to keep up with the business, and the firm started slipping. That's when the banks swooped in like vultures, claiming we were in default on a credit line my father had signed back in the 90s, long before Portugal joined the Eurozone. At this point, my sister and I had to step in running the firm, helping care for our father, and now also dealing with this sudden legal attack. We knew we were out of our depth, so we found the best lawyer we could afford, a guy who came highly recommended from an old family friend. And thank God we did, because he spotted something we never would have noticed. The bank presented a copy of the original credit agreement, supposedly signed by my father in the early 90s, but something was off. When the lawyer examined the document, he noticed that the original currency symbol, the escudo, which Portugal used before adopting the euro, had clearly been doctored. Someone at some point had handwritten a euro symbol right over the escudo sign, which looks kind of like a double/dollar sign. For anyone unfamiliar with finance, this is a huge deal. If the original loan was in escudos, and someone now tries to enforce repayment in euros at face value, not adjusted for currency conversion, you're talking about demanding a repayment more than 4 or 5x what was actually borrowed. That's not just sleazy, it's borderline criminal. Our lawyer pounced on this. He built a case around the altered document and how the bank was trying to exploit the euro conversion to squeeze every last cent out of a dying man and his family. That discovery became a cornerstone of our legal defense and the reason we were able to beat back most of their claims. And here's the part that still makes my blood boil. We weren't even trying to get out of the debt. We were ready to settle. We had multiple well-located properties, easily worth more than the amount owed, and we offered them up to the bank as collateral or partial payment, but they refused. They claimed the properties weren't good enough and said they wanted everything. They tried to take the entire business, every asset, and even our family home, the place we grew up in, the same place where my father was slowly dying. Their greed knew no bounds. Thanks to that lawyer, we managed to stop them from taking everything, but it came at an enormous emotional cost. Watching people in suits try to gut your family's life while your dad fades away in the next room, that sticks with you. I still think about that euro sign scrawled over the escudo like they thought no one would notice. Someone in that bank counted on us being too distracted, too overwhelmed, too emotionally wrecked to fight back. Well, we fought, and to this day, I hope whoever was behind that stunt gets exactly what they deserve. Story 9. Not a lawyer, but I got caught in one of these contract traps as a college student, and it still pisses me off when I think about it. So back in undergrad, I was renting an off-campus house with 2 friends. It was one of those typical student rental situations: old appliances, mystery stains on the carpet, and a landlord who definitely had better things to do than maintain a 60-year-old property being slowly destroyed by waves of 19-year-olds. Anyway, we were reviewing the lease before signing, and we noticed a clause that said tenants would be responsible for the first $100 of any repair during the lease term. That raised some eyebrows. We weren't careless, but we also weren't made of money, and considering the age of the place, we were worried that things might start falling apart fast. So we brought it up with the landlord. He was super chill about it, too chill, in hindsight. Said the clause was just to protect against negligence, and that it only applied if we, for example, broke a window throwing a football indoors or clogged the sink with ramen noodles. Basically, tenant-caused stuff. You won't have to worry about it, he said. It's never been an issue unless someone really screws something up. We also talked to the group living next door, who had the same landlord, and they confirmed that they'd only ever had to pay for a broken doorknob that one of them yanked off by accident. So we signed, thinking we'd be fine. Spoiler alert, we were not fine. Within the first 6 months, 3 different things went wrong. 1, the kitchen stove fan, which we reported on move-in, as old, loud, and sparking slightly, finally gave up the ghost and literally started smoking. Not metaphorically, I mean actual smoke coming out of it. 2, the bathroom sink drain, which was visibly rusted through and barely holding together when we moved in, completely collapsed like metal shards in the water type situation. 3, and the ancient window AC unit, which looked like it had been installed during the Cold War, stopped working during a heat wave. The repair guy said it was clogged with internal buildup and corrosion and had clearly been neglected for years. We figured these were obvious pre-existing issues and assumed the landlord would take care of them. He charged us $100 for each repair, claimed that since we lived there when the problems occurred, it fell under our financial responsibility. When we reminded him of the conversation we had before signing, he flat out denied ever saying it, just stonewalled us. No memory of that chat, no comment on the neighbor's similar experience, just it's in the lease. And unfortunately, he was right. The language in the lease didn't include any of the verbal assurances he gave us. No exceptions for pre-existing conditions. No language about landlord negligence or equipment, age, just tenant responsible for first $100 of any repair. The clause was technically neutral, but it was a total trap, because in a house that old, everything was already on its last leg, and the landlord knew that, We basically subsidized repairs for a place we were paying rent on, and he got away with it because we were naive and didn't get anything in writing. I've seen my fair share of genius traps buried in contracts, but one I encountered while reviewing a prenup was truly a masterpiece in financial strategy. So here's the backstory. I was working on a prenup for a wealthy couple, both successful in their own rights. The husband was particularly concerned about the potential financial fallout if they ever split. He didn't mind her spending money, but he was worried about a drastic lifestyle inflation that could wipe him out if they got divorced. So he came up with a clever clause to protect himself from what he saw as a potential financial disaster down the road. The clause was a lifestyle adjustment stipulation, and it was buried in the contract, not too obvious, but enough for someone paying attention to catch. Essentially, it stated that any purchases over $10,000, whether it be luxury items, vacations, cars, art, or even experiences, had to be mutually agreed upon in writing by both parties. If either person made a purchase of that magnitude without the other's explicit consent, the total amount spent would be deducted from their final settlement share. At first glance, it seemed a little strange, but nothing too out of the ordinary. The wife, on the other hand, didn't take it seriously. She thought the clause was just some quirky stipulation for the sake of it and didn't see it as a threat. In fact, it almost seemed like the husband was just putting in place a formality. She was used to an extravagant lifestyle and had no problem indulging in spontaneous luxury shopping sprees, private jet trips, exotic vacations, designer wardrobes, and weekend getaways to the finest spas. Fast forward several years, and while things were fine in the marriage at first, her spending habits began to ramp up. Every time she saw something she liked, it went on the credit card, no questions asked. She took several trips on private jets, bought art without a second thought, and had a wardrobe that could rival any Hollywood celebrities. The whole time, the husband was quietly keeping track of her unauthorized spending. By the time they filed for divorce, the total amount of unauthorized spending was in the millions. That's when the clause came into play. The husband's lawyers carefully pulled up the records and calculated the total amount she had spent without his consent over the years. And just like that, it was time to invoke the clause. When the wife went to collect her final payout after the divorce was finalized, she was shocked to discover that her settlement was slashed by almost half. She had been living lavishly for years, enjoying the fruits of a lifestyle funded by the family's wealth, but she had never realized the cost she was racking up until it was too late. The husband, who had been concerned about financial security from the very start, walked away with a much better settlement. He had anticipated how things could go if the relationship soured and built in a safeguard against it. In the end, his foresight and strategic planning worked out beautifully. I've never seen a prenup with such a clever way to keep a spouse in check financially. It was like a luxury spending trap she didn't even know she was walking into, and it ultimately cost her a substantial chunk of her future payout. It's a perfect example of how a well-drafted clause can protect one party and ensure they aren't left holding the bag if things go sideways, especially when it comes to extravagant spending habits. Anyone else come across similarly clever clauses in contracts or prenups? This one definitely stuck with me. Story 10. I've seen a lot of creative and sometimes downright nasty traps hidden in contracts and agreements, but one of the most devious ones I came across was in a marriage settlement agreement post-divorce. It was a real masterstroke in protecting assets while ensuring the ex-husband wouldn't end up paying forever if things didn't go as planned. So here's the backstory. The ex-husband agreed to pay his ex-wife generous spousal support after their divorce. However, there was one huge condition buried in the agreement that she didn't think twice about at the time. If she moved in with a new partner for more than 30 consecutive days, the spousal support payments would cease immediately, no exceptions. On top of that, the ex-husband went all in on this. He hired a private investigator agency and put them on retainer just in case his ex-wife ever violated the clause. He was clearly prepared for this to happen, even though his ex-wife was adamant she'd stay single forever and wasn't worried about it. Well, fast forward about a year after the divorce, and lo and behold, she moves in with her new boyfriend. She probably thought no one would ever notice. After all, how could he prove it? Well, she underestimated her ex's foresight and preparation. Private investigators went to work, documenting everything. They gathered evidence like mail forwarding to the new address, shared utility bills, and even changes in the lease agreement. They built a solid case showing that she had indeed moved in with her new partner for more than 30 consecutive days. When the ex-husband's lawyers presented the evidence, her spousal support was cut off immediately. No negotiation, no warning, it was all over. She tried to argue that it was just a temporary situation, that they hadn't even officially settled in together, but the documentation was airtight. The investigators had all the receipts literally. Her argument fell apart, and she was left with nothing. One day she was living comfortably, enjoying the support payments that had become a steady income. The next she was scrambling to make ends meet, all because of a clause she had brushed off when she was sure she'd never need to think about it again. In the end, it wasn't just a financial trap. It was a ticking time bomb. She had agreed to something that, in the heat of her new independence, she didn't think would ever come back to haunt her. But it did, and the impact was brutal. This whole situation was a reminder of how critical it is to read every line of an agreement, especially in something as crucial as a divorce settlement. One seemingly small clause can change everything, and in this case it really did. Story 11. I'm a lawyer, and one of the little habits I've picked up over the years has saved me more times than I can count, particularly with those everyday consumer contracts most people barely glance at. Here's the trick. When I'm handed a form to sign at a retail business, shipping center, car rental desk, appliance delivery, you name it, I just don't sign it. Not unless it's absolutely necessary for the transaction to proceed. I'll still fill in the address or necessary info, but I leave the signature line blank. 9 times out of 10, the employee either doesn't notice or doesn't care. And if they do, I don't argue. I'll sign if they insist. But more often than not, they don't. Let me give you a perfect example of how that tiny act of omission saved me $400. A while back, a buddy of mine left one of his golf clubs at my place after a visit. It was a pretty nice iron, part of an expensive set. I offered to ship it back to him, boxed it up carefully, and took it to a local UPS store. Standard procedure, fill out the shipping label, pay, and off it goes. The clerk handed me one of those standard liability waivers, the kind that basically says, if we break your stuff, that's your problem. I took it, filled in the shipping info, and conveniently skipped the signature line. No one noticed. Transaction complete. A few days later, my friend sends me a photo of the package. The box looks like it had been through a wood chipper. The golf club snapped in two like someone tried to fold it in half. I genuinely have no idea what sort of guerrilla rampage it went through between here and there, but it was a disaster. So I call up UPS and file a damage claim. Their immediate response, "Sorry, sir, but you signed a waiver releasing us from liability. You can guess where this is going." I calmly reply, "Feel free to pull that document. You won't find my signature anywhere on it." Silence on the other end. A few transfers later, I'm negotiating with someone who's suddenly a lot more helpful. In the end, I walked away with $400 to cover the damage, which is more than fair considering how hard it is to replace a single club in a premium set. Do I feel bad about it? Not in the slightest. These businesses depend on the fact that most consumers don't read what they're signing, or don't realize they can negotiate or decline entirely. So I don't feel the least bit guilty for flipping that dynamic around. If they're going to rely on people not paying attention, they can't complain when their own employees do the same. And for what it's worth, I'd recommend everyone at least read what they're asked to sign. But if you're in a situation where your signature isn't truly required and you're not comfortable with what you're being asked to agree to, maybe just don't. You might be surprised how often it works. Story 12. I'm a family lawyer, and while I try to avoid taking on clients whose goals or ethics clash with my own, I've still sat through some pretty disturbing consultations. One in particular sticks with me, not just because of the case details, but because of the insidious long game the other side tried to play. It wasn't a genius trap in the sense of clever wordplay hidden in legalese. It was a full-blown coordinated manipulation attempt that just so happened to start with a prenup and almost ended in a custody disaster. Identifying details changed to protect privacy and serious trigger warning for child abuse. About a decade ago, I was approached by a prospective client. Let's call her Megan, who was accompanied by her very overbearing parents. At first glance, Megan seemed meek, almost fragile. It became clear quickly she was heavily medicated and largely controlled by her parents. They did most of the talking. Megan barely looked up. Her story unraveled slowly. Years prior, she had left her small, deeply conservative hometown, where her family held some social clout thanks to church ties, and moved to my state. There, she met someone, we'll call him Alex, started a relationship, and had 2 kids. Alex was stable, employed, and by all accounts, a good parent. The relationship eventually fizzled, but they co-parented well. At this point, Megan's mental health history was still unknown to Alex. She had apparently been diagnosed in her late teens with a serious mental illness and was hospitalized briefly, but her condition had stabilized for a few years. Then things spiraled. A few years after the birth of their second child, Megan experienced a severe mental health relapse, possibly exacerbated by drugs. While Alex was out of town for work, she had a psychotic break, locked the older child in a closet, and attempted to harm the younger one. Neighbors heard screaming, called the police, and Megan was found in a full-blown delusional state. She was arrested, pled guilty but insane, and was committed to the state hospital. The kids went to Alex full-time, and Megan was sent back to her parents' state after release for further treatment. Flash forward nearly a decade. Megan and her parents walk into my office. They inform me that she's better now, by which they clearly meant compliant, medicated, and docile, and that they want to get her children back. Megan had not seen or spoken to her children since the incident. No supervised visits. No letters. No acknowledgement of the trauma that had occurred. Nothing. But here sits where it turned from sad to sinister. The grandparents, again doing most of the talking, explained their plan. They wanted Megan to temporarily move back to my state to petition the court for custody. Why? Because the kids still lived here with Alex, and any court would rightly reject an out-of-state move without significant justification. But they had a workaround. Once Megan regained custody, even partial custody, they'd quietly move the children back to their home state. Once there, they'd work things out with the local judges, who they confidently claimed would be understanding of Megan's return to God's path, and see Alex as the problem. Due to his sinful lifestyle, he was now living with a long-term partner, unmarried, and had tattoos. Gasp. They even proudly showed me the prenup Megan and Alex had signed years earlier, likely at the urging of her parents before the birth of their second child. It was subtle, but it laid groundwork for their long play. It included vague clauses about returning to community and religious standards, should there be a dispute, and terms implying relocation to Megan's home state would be in the best interest of any children. When I read it closely, I realized it had been designed from the beginning to serve as leverage for a future custody battle, long before Megan's mental health imploded. It was framed in nice words about shared values and spiritual development, but it was written to push jurisdiction toward their hometown church and court, knowing full well those judges would be sympathetic. The thing that made it all especially chilling, there was zero concern in that room for the kids' safety or well-being. This wasn't about love or healing. This was about control, about getting the kids back into their religious sphere, no matter the cost. When I gently told them this wasn't going to fly, legally or ethically, they started getting angry, accused me of being biased, immoral, part of the liberal court system. I politely told them our consultation was over and showed them out. As they left, the father shouted something about finding a real lawyer who understands family values. I watched the court dockets for a few months afterward, half expecting some other attorney to take the case, but thankfully nothing ever popped up. My guess is that everyone in town turned them away, or maybe someone reported the attempt to family services. Either way, I hope those kids stayed safe and far away from that entire mess. Sometimes the most disturbing legal traps aren't clever clauses. They're deeply thought out, slow-burn strategies hidden under years of manipulation. That prenup was just the first chess move in a game they thought they could win. But not on my watch. Story 13. A wealthy client of mine once drafted a will that secretly tested the loyalty of his friends. He left huge gifts to several people, but with one condition: each beneficiary had to agree to a catch within 30 days of his death, without knowing what it was. Once they signed, they learned they had to deliver a eulogy he'd pre-written. The speeches included brutal confessions about how they had wronged him in life. One had stolen money, another had cheated with his wife, and a third had spread terrible lies. They were forced to air their dirty laundry in front of everyone they knew. If anyone refused to give the speech, they forfeited the inheritance. The kicker? If someone rejected the speech, their share was added to the pot for those who accepted. Not only did they have to confess, but they also got more money for doing it. Watching those speeches at the funeral felt like the ultimate mic drop from beyond the grave. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.